Thank you, Mr. Roig. Very well said. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. I'm very happy that the State Department recognizes the human trafficking of doctors, something despicable. I mean, you cannot leave with your wife or with your kids. You only make 5% of whatever that country pays to the regime. And if you want to access the rest of the money, you can't until you go back to Cuba. That's called slavery. So thank you for bringing that up. And to you, Mr. Jacobstein, thank you once again for being here. We had the opportunity to talk to each other, so I'm very happy that we're going to be able to speak again. First and foremost, I just want to highlight that you and I were on the same page. We want the same thing. I'm the first one who wants to be convinced that in a totalitarian regime, as I said to the gentle Congresswoman from California, the Cuban Revolution is probably the most cruel and the most repressive revolution that the Western Hemisphere has seen since the arrival of Christopher Columbus. That was many years ago. That was in 1498, 92. We're talking about people who have brought repression to scientific levels, where the invincibility of the regime is in the heart of the average Cuban. That's why they would rather catch a raft, meet the sharks in the Strait of Florida, and reach the city that I represent, the city of Havana. So we're talking about people who are completely different. We're talking to Hamas. They're the Hamas of the hemisphere. Now you are telling me that there is this flourishing small and middle size businesses who are independent from the regime, totalitarian regime, has controlled for 62 years every single aspect of the Cuban population. Now you're telling me that this phenomenon is occurring, and that you and I will want to help them, of course, and I would love for you to convince not only me, but the Cuban exile community that I represent, that this is true. And I'm sure that you were going to be able to hear different reasons why, according to your statement, this is really happening. But the first question is the Biden administration planning to give the called MIPYMES access to the United States banking sector? Yes or no?
Thank you very much for the question, Madam Chair. As you know, in May 2022, we announced a series of measures to support the Cuban people, and one of those, measures, the majority have been implemented, including remittances, including a number of the issues I spoke to already. In terms of the private sector, we've not yet implemented those regulations, and we'll provide further information.
But are you thinking about, because opening the American banking sector, those are major words, because we're talking about then providing loans to those supposedly small business owners. Are you planning to open the American banking sector to the Cuban MIPYMES, as they call them?
Thank you, ma'am. I don't have further information on specific regulatory changes at this time.
Okay. Make sure that you send the word back to the State Department that is not going to be a very good idea, because number one, that violates the United States embargo, which happens to be codified in the United States Congress, as I'm sure you know. Now, let's go back to—
Any actions we take would be done under
please,
the law.
Yes, that's exactly what I want to hear, that whatever measures or regulations you're trying to implement are going to follow the United States law, meaning the United States embargo, or the United States embargo against the island of Cuba, unfortunately, because the real embargo is against the regime. The regime has it against its own people. Because you and I agree that if tomorrow morning the Cuban regime decides to lift the embargo that they have on the Cuban people, we would be very close friends, right? Don't you agree?
I would always be happy to be a very close friend of yours.
No, not of me, of the Cuban people. Well, thank you. I mean, I'm not sure about me, but I'm irrelevant. The United States would be a very close friend of the Cuban people if the Cuban regime decides tomorrow morning to lift the embargo they have on their people.
Absolutely. We've continually focused on holding the regime accountable and supporting the Cuban people. That's our focus.
Okay, so then now with the MIPYMES, how do you know that these are not just fronts, or most of them. We're talking about 9,000 of them. Supposedly, they're hiring 250,000 people, Cubans. How do you know that this is not a facade?
Thank you, ma'am. I know there's been much debate in the press and social media about the true measure of independence of Cuba's private sector. Our assessment is that there's a range of actors working in the Cuban economy. And some would like to speak in absolutes here. We don't think it's about absolutes, that either the Cuban economy is completely free and independent, or it is still 100% dominated by the government of Cuba and its cronies. Our embassy's assessment speaks to a more nuanced approach here, and our approach, therefore, must be more nuanced as well. And
so what you're trying to tell me is that you're willing, as long as you're willing to, as long as you're helping some Cubans who have some independence from the regime, it's inevitable that you would have to help some of the kids of the dirigentes.
No, I'm not saying that.
Well, so then what are you saying?
I spoke with Cuban independent entrepreneurs this week. I've many times in the past. These are people who are as far as possible from the Cuban regime. These are individuals suffering under the economic mismanagement of the regime. These are individuals who are making very tough economic choices. They told me, you don't understand. As a private sector, we have it worse here in Cuba than any private sector in the world. They're struggling because of economic mismanagement. And so
I hear it, but once again, I say that's in the hands of the regime. They could lessen those hardships in a minute. Now, let me just give you an example. I called a friend that I have in Havana, and she said, look, La Panadería La Antilla, that is in Calzado del Cerro 1571, used to belong or provide pan, bread, to El Ministerio del Interior. They closed, and 2 weeks after, they reopened as a MIPYME, right there. Then how can you make sure that you're not going to be helping those people who are the oppressors? Because I'm sure you don't want to be helping the oppressors, or you want to be help the oppressed. Tell me.
Thank you. Our embassy staff in Havana regularly engages with entrepreneurs and often visits their place of business. And they hold ongoing conversations with these individuals. So any derogatory information received on an entrepreneur is reviewed carefully and shared as appropriate within the interagency. And we'd welcome any information you'd like to share with us.
And I'm sure that I'm going to be feeding you a lot of it. Now, the imports, you know that there's something called GAESA, which is this institution, it belongs to the military, that controls every money that flows in and out of Cuba. So how is the Biden administration going to help just the Cuban people without going through GAESA, which is the one that controls the flows of dollars? How do you do that?
Thank you. This is a complicated situation. It's very tough, and we don't speak in absolutes here. We need nuance if we really want to focus on...
Speak nuanced means that you do have to be sleeping with the devil. Is that what you're telling me? Speaking nuanced.
No, I think it means that if we're supporting the Cuban people, we have to work within the system that exists. This is difficult. We wish it didn't. As I said, the private sector is suffering. They admit that, and we're looking for all means possible to support that Cuban sector as the humanitarian crisis on the island deepens and as outmigration continues.
Unfortunately, you have to deal with the regime, and you know it. Now, there's another one called Guajirito that has $15 million in exports. Could you imagine a regular Cuban having $15 million in exports? Wow, that's great. Who is Guajirito? I mean, who do you think they are? Because they are being showcased by the Cuban regime. You think that the average Cuban could have an enterprise that exports $50 million?
Absolutely not. And these businesses tend to be extremely small.
Okay. All right, tell me.
Yeah, ma'am, these businesses tend to be extremely small, suffering. These are individuals who told me...
The real ones, you mean? They're real, the ones that are not enchufados with the regime.
Yeah, the independent entrepreneurs are about 1/3 of the economy, 10,000 small, medium-sized enterprises.
Right. I will just ask you one more question, and then I will recognize my fellow members of the subcommittee. On November 20th of 2023, the United States Embassy in Havana hosted a concert for hip-hop artist who happens to be a convicted felon called Big Fredia. And on June, you showed a movie, Changing the Game, which is about biological men competing in women's sports. What does that have to do with advancing the freedom in Cuba?
So the U.S. Embassy in Havana, through our public diplomacy section, we engage in a wide range of activities to advance U.S. foreign policy goals in Cuba, including respect for human rights. So events that focus on the human rights of individuals belong to often marginalized communities, as Big Frida, a member of the African-American community, LGBT community, such as the program with her, help us to engage wider and younger audiences. And during her visit, Big Frida drew on the popularity of her music and performances to engage in a wide range of discussions with the LGBTQ plus population, with the Afro-Cuban population, and shared history on the importance of Black cultural influence in music.
Mr. Jacobstein, I believe that maybe the Cubans, the average Cuban who loves and adores the United States, would like to be receiving something different, maybe something a little bit more edifying, more gratifying from the United States Embassy. I'm not saying that these are not important topics, but for the average Cuban who's suffering exactly what you guys just told me is just, maybe we should send word to the embassy that maybe the Cubans would want to see something else coming from the United States. Now I yield back.
Thank